Lizzie. Let's make some watercolor paint today. I recently got this box of glass test tubes of watercolor pigments, and I'm so excited to try them out with you. There's a bunch in the box, but first we need to gather all of our supplies. We'll need some pans to put the finished paint in. Then we need the rest of our supplies. I've got some in this cabinet and some elsewhere, kind of scattered all over the studio, so we'll have to find those all one by one. Up next we have our glass paint muller. Because we're making a small batch of paint, I'm using this miniature muller instead of a full-size one. We'll also use this ground glass palette, which has been either sanded or sandblasted to make a textured surface, and that helps grind up the pigment really finely so that it goes better into the watercolor binder. Then we have the miniature muller, which is so cute, and a tiny mortar and pestle. We'll set that to the side, and then it's time to choose what color we want to make today. They're all so beautiful. I really had a hard time deciding which one to make, but let me know in the comments below which one was your favorite and what you would like to see in the next video. The fun thing about the powdered pigments like this is we can also mix and match between them to make new colors rather than just these ones that are in the box. The tubes of pigment themselves are so gorgeous. I've been keeping some of them on my desk just so I can look at them because they're so pretty. They're all made in Japan, and I got these from a website in the UK called Choosing Keeping because the maker in Japan, you can't order directly from them. So I spent ages looking at all the different colors trying to choose which one I wanted to make. And I'm hoping to make them all over time, but of course we have to start off with one as the first color, and I really had such a hard time deciding, but I ended up going with a blue color because blue is my favorite, and so that seemed like a good option. I'm interested to see different colors will interact differently with the binder depending on what's in the pigment itself. They've all got different chemical properties, and I think it'll be really fun to experiment with different pigments and different binders, different methods of making paint. And we can also make gouache, not just watercolor, by adding extra powder to make it opaque. So I think that this will just be so much fun to do all these experiments with you and see what we can make. I ended up picking this tube of blue pigment, but I'm so curious to know which one you would have chosen and what you would like to see next. So to start off with, before we can actually start making the paint itself, the pieces of pigment are too large to go into the binder effectively, and so we need to grind them up. These pigments specifically are designed that you could do this by hand, by mixing them with your fingers and the pigment, but we're going to use the mortar and pestle today. So I got a miniature mortar and pestle because we're making a small batch of paint, and I know we're going to lose a little bit of the pigment to the mortar and pestle itself, and I was worried if I used a full-size one we would lose a lot of pigment to the mortar and pestle. So I'm going to pour just a little bit in there, and then it'll be time to grind it up. I don't know if there's any specific guidance on exactly how crushed the pigment needs to be, so I figured I would just kind of keep crushing it till it seemed really powdery and then go from there. My understanding is that even if you didn't get everything to exactly the right size with the mortar and pestle, it'll still make paint okay. It might just take longer to mull with the glass muller and the palette, which is fine because that part is so pretty and I love watching videos of it. But I wanted to get us relatively far along with this part of the process. And then once it's all ground up, it's time to clean off the mortar and pestle as much as I can. I wasn't sure what this brush was for when I got it, but it turns out it works great for this. A lot of it ended up sticking to the mortar and pestle, so I'm glad we got the small one for this. And then I poured it all out onto the palette, and then it's time to add some binder. This particular binder is specific for these pigments. You could probably use it with other pigments too, but it's designed to work with these. And it's really thick, kind of like Jello, so there's not that usual really pretty clip of pouring the binder into the well of pigment, like making a volcano out of vinegar and baking soda, like in grade school. But once I got the pigment added, I mixed it initially with a palette knife just to kind of get everything mixed together a little bit and get started a little bit on the mulling with the palette knife. It was such a nice texture to play with the knife, kind of almost like frosting but a little bit thicker, but definitely not edible. And of course, now for the part we're all familiar with paint making is the mulling, which is so gorgeous to watch and made a really lovely sound too, but unfortunately the microphone stopped recording audio for a good chunk of this, and so there's no audio to go along with this, but for the next video hopefully we'll have better luck. And so what I did here is I used circular motions to grind the pigment and the binder together on the ground glass palette until it kind of got too flattened out overall, and I felt like it wasn't really mixing all that well anymore. And then I used the palette knife to make it all into a pile again in the middle, and then mold it again. And you can see kind of in the bottom right hand corner it looks like a silicone spatula. It's meant to be like a paint shaper, paint scraper, but it works great for corralling all of the pigment back into the center. And this part was just so nice and soothing and fun. I thought it would be like hard, like kneading dough or something where your hands get tired, but it was actually just really fun and pretty. And every time you pull the muller off, it makes that really cool fractal design, which I thought was just so gorgeous because of how the surface tension of the binder interacts with everything else. But here we go with our pile of paint. And so the way this works is I'll mull it and then test a little patch on some paper, and then I can see from there if I need to add more binder or more pigment, or if it just needs to be molded a little bit more. So I grabbed my brush and some watercolor paper, and look, we made paint, which is so cool. And I'm testing with adding increasing amounts of water so that I can see how opaque it is and how it interacts with the paper when there's not just tons and tons of paint on there. And it just felt like it needed a little bit more mulling, so back to the, well, not drawing board, mulling board, I suppose. And all of a sudden it just like really got this super perfect texture. So I decided to test it out and see if it was ready. I don't know if you're supposed to put water in it to get it up on the brush directly from the palette at this point, but I figured the water will evaporate and probably not cause too many problems. And you can see that I didn't really do anything other than keep mulling it between the first and the second test swatches, and it does look different, which is just so cool. And so I was really happy with how it turned out. And then of course it's time to put it into a watercolor pan. These are half pans because I knew I would want a pretty small batch because I want to be able to try out with each of the colors and use different binders or turn some into gouache. And so I grabbed these half pans, and they look really cute in that jar, but they were really hard to get a pan back out of there. But we got it. We were successful. And so now, oh, it's so cute. Okay. Now we will use the palette knife to load the paint into the watercolor half pan. And then it occurred to me that right now, since this is the only pan, it'll be pretty easy to identify, but in not all that long, hopefully. As we continue our adventures in paint making, they're gonna be kind of hard to tell apart, especially if I'm making multiple paints from the same pigment. And so I took these little round label circle stickers that I have, and I drew a teeny tiny little apothecary style label to go on the watercolor half pan, because A, I didn't want to buy extra labels, and B, I don't know if they make them this small. It was really hard to get the camera to focus on it that tiny. But in case you can't read it, it just says the number of the pigment, because that seems to be how they're identified. At least the numbers are written in English for that part. So I copied that over, and then the binder that I used with it. So I peeled off the back of the label, and trying really hard not to drop it on the wet paint here, I put it on the half pan, and I can't wait to see a collection of these all together with the teeny tiny little labels. I think that'll be really cute. But this is the way it looked in the end, and here it is next to the pigment that we started off with. And you can see they look pretty similar, although it's a little bit more saturated now that it's, of course, wet and has the pigment in it. It'll be interesting to see how it looks once it's dried. And then I wanted to be able to kind of keep a record of all of our experiments in paint making all together. Maybe it's my background in chemistry, but the idea of a little paint making lab notebook, I just couldn't pass it up. So I thought I would keep track of the pigments we're using and the binders and then our little swatch. And I'm super curious to see how opaque the paint is, because watercolor paint, well, I suppose all paint, can vary wildly in opacity based on the color. And it's nice to kind of know when you start painting which ones are going to be really opaque versus not, particularly if you are doing watercolor in ink where you're going to be painting over the ink lines, because really opaque watercolor on top of ink will cover up the ink, and it can look a little odd when you go to scan it or just when you're looking at it in the end, because your brain kind of expects the ink to show through the watercolor all the way. And so I made a tiny sketch with pencil, and then I'm making a tiny little sketch with ink so that we can paint on top of those with our new watercolors and see how opaque they are, whether or not the pencil or the ink shows through underneath the watercolor. And I'll do it in a couple little sections so that we can see how it looks with a thick layer of paint and a thin layer of paint, because of course the amount of water we're using will affect the opacity pretty strongly, because even a really opaque paint, if you dilute it enough, will be transparent. And I started off trying to get paint off of the palette, but I didn't do good of a job of cleaning it, so I ended up adding some water to my brush and getting the paint from our pan, which was super fun to kind of use that for the first time. And here you can see I'm mixing up a little bit more dilute paint, and then I'll do a little section with that. When it's wet right now in the video, it's all kind of showing up the same, but each sequential section has less paint and more water so that I can kind of see how transparent it is. And this one is, to me, kind of in the middle on opacity. I think that it would cover up pencil pretty effectively. Ink would show through, but not all the way. And then I really wanted to try making a little print of the fractal design, because I just think it's so pretty. I think it would be fun to flip through this notebook once there's a whole bunch of fractals and all these beautiful colors. And so I thought we could try seeing how it turns out, making a little print of it. And so I mixed up just a little bit more water onto the palette and used the Muller, and that's what the fractal looks like. I hope you enjoyed seeing some of the process for how I made this watercolor paint, and I'm excited to make more with you. Let me know in the comments what you think about how this turned out and what color you'd like to see next.